Welcome to History 252, Modern American History. My name is Matthew Booker. I'm the professor for this course. I'm an associate professor of history in the history department at North Carolina State. Thank you for your patience in working with me this week as I'm in a workshop with K through 12 teachers. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most important questions in modern American history. And I want to use this question as a way to get at a fundamental problem in all of human experience, a problem that historians address as a fundamental issue in their work. The topic for today is the meaning of freedom. What would it mean when roughly a third of the population of the southern states of the United States were quite suddenly thrust into freedom with the destruction of slavery over the course of the war and with the 13th Amendment in 1865. So that is my topic for today's lecture. The larger question, even larger than that critical question in American history, is the question of contingency, as historians use the word. The point to begin with is that in all of the universe, the only thing that is certain is what has already occurred. Only the past can be known truly. The future is entirely dark, even if we have to think of certain events as so likely to occur that we call them laws. For example, if I were to drop my coffee cup right now, I'm fairly certain it would fall on the floor. But I only know that because my coffee cup has done so in the past. So it is to our discipline of history is given the critical task of trying to understand not just when and how, but also why events occurred in the past. History is a balance between patterns and contingency, between what can be predicted and what is totally unpredictable. These are the two great realities of human experience, and historians must take both seriously. In this classroom, all of us throughout the semester will be historians, you as much as me. Today I want to emphasize the importance of contingency in history, uncertainty, and unpredictability. In practice, what this means is that to be an historian, you must constantly be surprised by the past. Nothing is inevitable. We fall into the error of thinking that because the past happened a certain way, it had to happen that way. American history, however, disproves this fallacy again and again. All of these moments of uncertainty which work out in a very particular way. So let's go back to our topic for today, the meaning of freedom. Let's take the end of the Civil War. So here's the scene. It's April 15th, 1865. Lee's army has surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, but the Confederate government has not surrendered, and in fact, the Confederacy still has several armies left in the field. The most important is the army under General Joseph Johnston, stationed in North Carolina. So on April 15th of 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the United States Army moving north from Savannah, Georgia through the Carolinas, rides out from his headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina, to meet with General Joseph Johnston, the commander of the largest remaining Confederate army, and both men hope to end the Civil War. So I'm going to read to you now something taken from Sherman's autobiography, which I recommend to you and is located in D.H. Hill Library, along with thousands of other primary sources from American history. Quote, "As soon as we were alone together," Sherman wrote, "I showed him the dispatch announcing Mr. Lincoln's assassination," which of course had occurred, you remember, just previously to their meeting. "And I watched him closely. The perspiration came out in large drops on his forehead, and he did not attempt to conceal his distress. He denounced the act as a disgrace to the age and hoped I did not charge it to the Confederate government. I told him I could not believe that he or General Lee or the officers of the Confederate Army could possibly be privy to acts of assassination. But I would not say as much for Jeff Davis, George Sanders, and men of that stripe. I explained to him that I had not yet revealed the news to my own personal staff or to my army, and that I dreaded the effect when made known in Raleigh. Mr. Lincoln was peculiarly endeared to the soldiers, and I feared that some foolish woman or man in Raleigh might say something or do something that would madden our men, and that a fate worse than that of Columbia would befall the place." Unquote. So what Sherman is describing is a moment of immense uncertainty. Lincoln's assassination raised all sorts of questions. It raised the question of whether Southerners intended to attempt, whether it was a conspiracy organized by the Confederate government, which is what he meant by Jeff Davis and George Sanders, the president and vice president of the Confederacy, political leaders, whether it was a conspiracy organized by the Confederate general staff, that is, by the Army, men like Joseph Johnson and the other generals, or whether it was a widespread conspiracy involving Confederate civilians. And that raises a really profound question, one that we have easily forgotten about because it didn't happen, but one which might have happened. And that is, what would occur when, in the end, Johnston would surrender his army, when the war was over? Would the end of the war bring anarchy, chaos, race riots? Would it bring guillotines set up across the South? Typically after civil wars, the winners execute the leaders of the defeated nation. Look at the French Revolution or the English Revolution. In those cases, terrible violence occurs, or Rwanda, for example, more recently. But that didn't happen after the American Civil War. So that's what I mean about contingency. Why not? What happened? Why did it occur? And to ask those questions, we really have to ask ourselves, we have to remind ourselves to be surprised by the past and how it worked out. So let's back up a bit and think about how the Civil War ended and what it meant. The Civil War is the bloodiest war in all of American history. Something like 750,000 soldiers, we now think, according to the latest research, some of which I will provide to you on our website. Something like 750,000 soldiers on both sides were killed, approximately a third of them in battle, and another two-thirds from disease. Another almost 400,000 men were severely wounded or maimed in the conflict, meaning that they lost a leg or an eye or an arm, or worse. So to put that in context, the American Revolutionary War, which lasted almost twice as long, only had a total of about 4,000 casualties. Or to put it another way, more American men died in the American Civil War than died in all other American wars combined. Americans were more effective at killing one another than anyone has ever been at killing us. So to think about just dead soldiers, though, deeply underestimates the impact of this war, the only war in modern history fought on our own soil. Consider the effects on the men on those families who lost soldiers in battle. Not only were the wounded and maimed soldiers crippled for life, unable to work, but the widows, the orphan children, the elderly parents, who were abandoned essentially at a time when the sole support of most families was a single male breadwinner. The Civil War left behind a wreckage in the American South in particular, but it also included the closest the United States has ever come to a military coup, with the assassination of the American president and the attempted murder of his legal successors, the vice president and the Secretary of State, in 1865. So there were many devastating impacts of the Civil War. But even more surprisingly, perhaps, is what did not happen. No coup, no military dictatorship, no dismemberment of the southern states, no mass confiscation of land from the defeated slaveholders, not even execution or long imprisonment for Confederate officials. Even Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, served only a short prison term before being pardoned. Again, consider the difference between the end of this war and the end of almost every other modern civil war, where the losers' heads are chopped off and put on pikes. So to understand just how remarkable the end of the American Civil War is, we have to remember how unlikely, how uncertain the moment was in 1865. So the freeing of the slaves in 1865 forced the United States to face one of the most basic questions in all of its history. Freedom for the former slaves challenged basic arrangements of the American Constitution, which of course had explicitly permitted slavery with the Three-Fifths Compromise. Freedom for the slaves called into question the disposition of power between the states and Congress, and it asked what the Civil War had been for and whether the North had truly won. So the question, what would freedom mean, was urgent, not only for the some 1/3 of the Southern population that had just previously been enslaved property, but also for the rest of the nation and for its future. To understand just how difficult this was, how uncertain this moment was, we have to remember that emancipation was not an original war aim for the North. Republicans like Abraham Lincoln had been so opposed to slavery, not so much where it was, but where it might be. They worried about the expansion of slavery into the American West, and it was that future of slavery which of course had motivated Southern states to secede, despite promises that slavery would be left alone where it existed. So emancipation was not really on the table in 1860. In fact, Abraham Lincoln at first viewed freeing the slaves as a way to win the war, not the purpose of the war. So late in 1862, for example, Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, freed slaves only in those areas where American armies had occupied Confederate territory, so that slaves in Union states of Maryland and Delaware remained legally bound. As late as summer of 1864, locked in a bitter re-election campaign, Lincoln insisted that the only purpose of the war was to restore the Southern states to the Union, not to destroy slavery. So what changed between 1864 and 1865? What changed was two things. First, Union armies advancing into the South in 1864 were swamped with escaping slaves. Union commanders called these people contraband, meaning enemy property. But Union commanders did not want to send back slaves to their lawful owners in the South because those people, the slaves, were essential laborers to maintain the Confederate States of America. And slave labor was essential to the functioning of the Confederate Army. It was, after all, slave laborers who built the defenses around Petersburg and Vicksburg and Richmond. So the first factor in changing Lincoln's mind and in changing the purpose of the war was that the slaves freed themselves. They freed themselves and fled to Union armies, forcing Union Army commanders to come up with a new policy toward the freed people who had freed themselves. The second factor had to do very much with the last phases of the war. After 1863, facing resistance to the draft in the North, the United States finally allowed African Americans to enlist. By August of 1864, there were more than 130,000 African American men in the United States Army. By the end of the war, perhaps 20% of all black men of military age in the United States or the occupied South had served in the United States Army. That is higher than the percentage for white men. So the critical point here is that the former slaves themselves forced the issue of freedom. So many deserted to Union lines, and so many fought for the Union to win the war, that it was impossible to ignore them. Much of the time in history, we are all subject to huge forces beyond our control. The accident of our birth into this particular moment, or this particular family, for example. But this is an example in 1864, when hundreds of thousands of individual decisions changed history. So by 1865, slavery was destroyed. The 13th Amendment essentially recognized the reality that the former slaves had created by running away and by joining the army to destroy the Confederacy. But what would the end of slavery bring? What would be the reality of daily life? Would it be citizenship with full rights in the United States? Would it be a kind of second-class citizenship within the southern states, a kind of American apartheid? What would be that future for Southern African Americans? This question was bound up with the readmission of the Confederate States, the process we call Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction, the first phase, began immediately with the end of the Civil War, which of course occurred only a few days, as we just heard, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. President Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, followed a plan that Lincoln had sketched out, a very lenient plan for readmission of the southern states back into the Union. When 10% of white Southerners took an oath of loyalty to the United States, that state could come back into the Union. Just 10% of the white male population of any particular state. He insisted that all confiscated property be returned to the former landholders. No Southerners were forced into exile. And Johnson ended up pardoning over 13,000 former Confederates to allow them back into politics and public life. White Southerners' civil rights were quickly restored after the Civil War. It's an extraordinary decision on the part of Johnson, and of course, these were Lincoln's ideas originally. Southern whites, however, are not satisfied with their rapid readmission because, in part, Union armies remain in parts of the South, and many white Southerners are deeply disturbed by the possibility of black freedom, of citizenship, and full equality. So in the summer of 1865, all 7 states readmitted under President Johnson's liberal plan imposed black codes. They are a form of American apartheid. They define African Americans as agricultural employees who cannot do anything else. If an African American is found without labor, without a contract for labor, he or she can be fined or hired out to a plantation. African Americans need passes to enter towns. They are forbidden from owning firearms. And, perhaps most brutally, black children can be taken from their parents and given to whites as servants until they turn 21. This sort of scene is common across the South in the years after 1865. It's a form of readmission into slavery, of bonded tenancy. And these new ways of establishing African Americans as a kind of second-class citizen in the South are enforced through violence, through incredible violence against the former slaves. Southern whites, many of them Confederate veterans, lash out at blacks and at whites who assisted them in resisting white dominance. Beginning 1866, the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee, begins a campaign of terror against blacks who attempt to vote or express other forms of basic civil rights. Between 1865 and 1868, in my own family's home state of Texas, my father's family, there are more than 1,000 murders of blacks by whites. 500 indictments are returned. That is, courts indict over 500, grand juries indict over 500 whites for murdering blacks, often for voting. But not a single white man is convicted of murder in those states. So what's happening is the establishment of a new kind of white supremacy in the former defeated Confederate states. Northerners, particularly in Congress, look what's going on in the South and they begin to wonder what the war was fought for. And so, Union leaders in Congress imposed their own vision of freedom for the former slaves. First with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which defines freedom for the African Americans, the former slaves, by guaranteeing them citizenship and by saying that all people born in the United States, except Indians, are U.S. citizens. It guarantees equal rights under the law to all persons regardless of race. And it says that it's the duty of the federal government to intervene within the states when necessary to enforce these rights. This is a revolutionary extension of federal power brought on by the Black Codes and by the violence against the slaves, Congress reacting against Southern white violence. This reaction, I should say, is reinforced in the 14th Amendment, which essentially confirms the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The 14th Amendment also belatedly punishes Confederate leaders, many of whom had been lending their voices to the campaigns of white supremacy. It now states that anybody who'd carried out rebellion against the United States and who had previously been an officer of the United States Army or a member of Congress is now excluded from holding office going forward. But almost all of them will be pardoned by Andrew Johnson and by subsequent congressional action. So by the early 1870s, we have two definitions of freedom at stake. One is Congress's definition, which essentially treats African Americans as free within the law, if not in practice, and a white Southern version, which establishes a kind of apartheid for Southern whites. So long as American forces, armed forces, U.S. armed forces, occupy the South, Congress's vision of equality for whites and blacks based on the law is possible. But the minute that American armies leave the occupied South, this equality is endangered. There is a third vision of freedom, and it is the vision of the former slaves themselves. Their vision is in some ways the most old-fashioned. In many ways, former slaves view the small white farmers of the Upper South, in places like the Hill Country of North Carolina, as their model, because it is economic independence, it is the ownership of one's own property that defines freedom for many African Americans. Their goal is land ownership. So slaves are not satisfied either with the notion of second-class citizenship that white Southerners impose, nor with the simple vision of equality under the law. What they want is economic independence, and their vision is of freedom based on their labor. So, for the former slaves, freedom is practiced rather than written down. And for many former slaves, freedom happens in two ways. They operate in two ways. The first is they vote with their feet. The roads of the South after the war are filled with freed people on the move, searching for their lost relatives, for families sold down the river years before. The other way that the former slaves seek to get the economic independence, to find the freedom that they seek, is by trying to buy land. And this gives rise to a paradoxical situation, which is sharecropping. The great tragedy, perhaps, of the post-war South is found in sharecropping. Sharecropping is a system by which large white landowners, who had lots of land but no laborers to work it, contracted with impoverished former slaves who had labor but no land to share the benefits, the profits from each acre of cotton harvested, planted and harvested by the former slaves, by the freed people, and sold by the landowner on behalf of both. So the idea of sharecropping was that a freed family, like the ones shown in this picture, would put in their labor for an entire season, borrow money to plant the crop and to live in a shack on the former slaveholder's property, and then at the end of the season share the profits, if any, from each bale of cotton. In practice, what happens, however, is that sharecropping will impoverish both the land, because nobody has any reason to take care of the soil under this arrangement, and the people involved. And so we end up with a situation as we move into the late 19th century in which you have impoverished people living in an increasingly impoverished land with no real freedom for African Americans in the South at all. But to understand why African Americans would embrace sharecropping, because many did, we have to understand their goal. Their goal was to save money, to work hard, and to eventually buy their own land, to buy their way out of sharecropping. We'll take up this conundrum, this paradox, when we talk about the New South next week. I look forward to seeing you then. In 1865, the United States faced one of the most central questions in its history. The fate of the former slaves challenged basic arrangements of the U.S. Constitution. It called into question the disposition of power in the states and in Congress, and it asked what the Civil War had really been for and whether the North had truly won. The fundamental question was, what would freedom mean? To understand that, we have to remember that the Civil War, from a Union perspective, was not fundamentally about emancipating slaves. Emancipation was not an original war aim. Lincoln viewed freeing the slaves as a way to win the war, not the purpose of the war. Late in 1862, he said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." His Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, freed slaves only in Confederate states and areas occupied by U.S. armies within the Confederate states, so that slaves in Maryland and Delaware, both Union states, were, for example, remained legally bound. As late as summer 1864, Lincoln still insisted that the only purpose of the war was to restore Southern states to the Union. So I want to turn now to the most fundamental question raised at the end of the war. And this was, of course, the question of what freedom would mean. In 1865, the United States faced one of the most central questions in all of its history. The fate of the former slaves challenged the basic arrangements of the United States Constitution, which had, of course, explicitly permitted slavery in the Three-Fifths Compromise. Freedom, the destruction of slavery, called into question the disposition of power in the states and in Congress. And it asked what the Civil War had been for, and whether the North had truly won, and if so, what, in fact, it had won. So the question, what would freedom mean for the freed slaves of the American southern states of the Confederacy, really raises fundamental questions for American history. To understand that, we need to back up to the beginning of the Civil War. Remember that emancipation was not an original war aim. Lincoln viewed freeing the slaves as a way to win the war, not the purpose of the war. Late in 1862, President Lincoln said, quote, If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. In the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, Lincoln only freed slaves within Confederate states, so that slaves in Maryland and Delaware, both Union states, for example, remained legally bound. As late as summer of 1864, Lincoln still insisted that the only purpose of the war was to restore the Southern states to the Union. So, what forced the United States to change its policy so dramatically? Two things did. First, Union slaves advancing into the South, beginning especially after 1863, were swamped with escaping slaves. At first, Union commanders called these people fleeing from slavery contraband, meaning enemy property. These people obviously could not be sent back to the South, where slave labor was the basis of the Confederate economy, and where, in fact, slave laborers built the defenses that Confederate armies relied on, for example, around Petersburg and Richmond. So using African Americans, that is to say, refusing to return African Americans to the South, was the first step in changing American policy towards slavery. It was a war decision, and it was one fundamentally that was made by the slaves themselves as they ran away from their plantations and from their masters in the South. They forced the issue on Union commanders. The second issue is perhaps even more profound in understanding why Lincoln and the United States changed its policy towards slavery during the Civil War. After 1863, the United States for the first time allowed black enlistment. By August of 1864, there were more than 130,000 African American men in the American military, in the United States military. By the end of the war, perhaps 20% of all black men of military age in the United States or occupied South had served in the United States Army. That is higher than the percentage for white men. So the former slaves themselves forced Lincoln to change his policy about emancipation. So many former slaves deserted to Union lines, and so many fought for the Union at the critical point in the war, that it was impossible to ignore them. Much of the time in history, we are all subject to huge forces beyond our control. For instance, the accident of our birth into a particular moment or into a particular family. Those are accidents. But this, 1863 to 1865, this is an example where hundreds of thousands of individual decisions changed history. By 1865, slavery was destroyed. The 13th Amendment banned involuntary servitude in the United States, but functionally, the slaves themselves had destroyed the institution, first by fleeing from slavery, and secondly, by taking up arms against it. But what did it mean that slavery was destroyed? What would be the reality of daily life for millions of former slaves? This question was bound up in the political decisions about what to do with the defeated, treasonous states of the southern United States. Should they be readmitted to the Union, and under what conditions?